Hello, everybody, and welcome to Spectrum Sessions, the podcast where we platform unfiltered autistic voices and celebrate our differences. I'm Heather from the National Autistic Society Scotland, and today we're here with Carse Wilson. Chris, would you mind introducing yourself to anyone who doesn't know who you are?
Sure, thank you, and thank you very much for having me on. I'm a writer, I'm a runner. I was late diagnosed as autistic when I was 40. It was just a couple of years ago. And I suppose I'm here because I've written a novel called Frey. It's all about mental health and nature, and which has had some lovely reactions, including Alan Cumming saying that he couldn't recommend it more highly. So I'm very excited to be here, talk about diagnosis, talk about writing, and to share a bit about my experience.
That's great. Thank you for coming. So I like to start off by talking about special interests. Would you mind telling us about one of your current special interests or fixations?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think for me, it's probably with many autistic people, there's this kind of fixations, sort of hyper focus moments, things that come and go. But I definitely have running and writing, but running in particular at the minute is it's one of those interests that's always lasted. And I think what for me is is good about it, is healthy about it, is and I'm sure people will get this from other pastimes, communities, other kind of areas, is I can find myself being totally into a tiny area of it. So I'm like,
Mhm.
in recent years, become totally fascinated with trail running and being out in nature. Whereas when I was younger, it was kind of like track and it was being competitive and it was all times and numbers and things. So I think there's something I really like about that it's an interest that kind of flexes and there's so many niches and things to sort of fall down into. Um, and it's good for me. That's the other thing. We'll probably talk a
Yeah.
bit about that. But I think there's probably things that you get interested in that maybe aren't harmful, but at least maybe are neutral to you. But this is something that is helps me a great deal. So the fact that I'm totally get completely obsessed with it and love it
Mhm.
is no bad thing.
That's great. And you say you were diagnosed at 40. Um, would you mind telling us a bit about your diagnosis journey and how it felt to finally, after 40 years, get that diagnosis?
Yeah, of course. So it came about so I started the process of being diagnosed just before the COVID lockdowns in 2020. So I'd gone to my GP sort of late in 2019. I'd done, all the various kind of questionnaires that give you scores that indicate, they don't tell you for sure, but indicate whether you might be, likely, very likely to be autistic. And I was scoring, very, very high on everything that I was looking at. But the bit that led to that, and the thing that kind of came before is it was actually watching not the most recent programs that Chris Packer made, but the first program he made about his own diagnosis as being autistic and finding that out, which I think he did. It's more than 5 years ago now. And I'd long had mental health challenges of various sorts that I didn't understand, that I couldn't explain. I long had difficulties with, I can articulate them now. Probably at the time I couldn't explain them as well in the same way, but difficulties around sensory sensitivity, around social situations, around kind of routine and anything at all unexpected. But I think because of the wider is changing, but because of the wider sort of social stereotypes, the way that autism was presented growing up in the 80s and 90s, indeed, if it was presented at all, I didn't for a moment ever think I was autistic. I had no sense of that whatsoever. And it took Chris Packham being on TV, partly being somebody that I, admired, and really loved for many years, sharing many interests in bird watching, nature, and everything like that. But hearing him describe how he feels in situations he can't cope in, and how he feels in spaces that where he feels comfortable, which is, might be alone in the woods, some separate from people, separate from a built environment. It was quite emotional because it was like it was, it's a cliche in a way, but it was a real light bulb moment. It was like hearing somebody explaining to me how my brain worked for the first time, and it was really that was like, oh my god, this is me. This is how I feel, and that began the process. But then, like many people, I'm fortunate. I was able to get a diagnosis, but it took years. It took a very
Mhm.
long time. It took longer because of COVID, and it even recently, I'd had a conversation um, with the GP who referred me, and he actually had to kind of fight for my referral. It was rejected. He sort of resubmitted, and I saw him recently, and he said, now even just in those few years, I wouldn't get put forward because the waiting list is so bad because it's so hard to get through. So it was a tough process, and I really feel for everybody going through the same thing. It's very very
Mhm.
difficult.
Yeah, the waiting lists are really bad. I felt quite lucky as well. I got diagnosed almost 2 years ago now, so probably
Mm.
similar to you, and, I'm very glad that I wasn't on the waiting list for as long as some people are now.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
incredible, and I mean, he said, it's even they're finding around where we are in Scotland, and on the the east of Scotland and Fife, that unless somebody's in like a real crisis situation, they just get a form letter back just saying no.
Yeah.
So it's not even you're on the waiting list and you're waiting years. You're not getting onto the waiting list at all, which is obviously is unacceptable and is very 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 difficult.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, so to go back to your writing, your debut novel "Frey" released last year. You sent it over to us, and I've read it. It was great. Thanks so much for sending it. Would you mind telling the listeners a bit about the book and what inspired you to write it?
Yeah, of course. And thank you for reading it. That's really wonderful. So I've I've always written, along with running. It's always been a kind of a passion. It's always been something I've really, really loved and really kind of I don't know got a lot from diving deep into it. A lot of escapism, and there's also just a lot of beauty around language and how people use language well, which is something I adore. But the writing I'd done in secret. It's not something I've really told people about. The book itself started writing it back in 2016. So I was on a holiday up in Glencoe, went out for a run, and sort of went up, trying to go up the side of a Munro of a mountain, and I got caught out in the middle of a storm. So starting off, the weather was fine; it wasn't bad, but it turned and it became really really frightening really quickly. And as well as turning around and getting back down as quickly and safely as I could, there was something in that moment, and there was something in the intensity of seeing that storm, seeing the weather change, feeling so kind of small and vulnerable against like nature and the elements like that. And it just, I suppose I wanted to capture that. I wanted to sort of put that on the page because it was exciting, it was intimidating, it was frightening. But it felt like a way for me to start talking to writing about mental health because the that storm and seeing what that looked like, felt almost like a visual representation, a physical version of what an inner turmoil and inner difficulty
Mhm.
can feel like. So I started writing that. I got back soaked from the run, I had my phone out and just tapped some ideas in. And then the story took 4 years to write. It was done in little 10, 15-minute bursts on the bus to work. Didn't tell my wife until it was done, and she sort of believed me to start with. Um, but and what I then ended up going into is taking that setting and then thinking about what it means to be powerless, what it means to be lost, and again that sort of connects to that idea about mental health and control. And the story is it opens with it's all first person. It opens with a narrator whose father's run off to the Highlands just after the death of his wife, as the narrator's mother, and the narrator chases after him, desperate to find him, worried for him. But all they find is this abandoned cottage filled with thousands of paper notes where he's documenting his attempts to save his wife, who's dead. We know that she's dead. But he's convinced that she's somehow there in the mountains to be saved. So the story goes between the diary notes of the father and the narrator trying to find them. And it's this journey through their challenges with this underlying uncertainty of never being quite sure what's happening or what's going to happen next.
That's great. Yeah, it was a really interesting book. I hadn't really read anything like it before, but I quite enjoyed the setting and in the Highlands. It was really good to read something set
Thank
there.
you.
Um, so are you writing anything right now? And if so, can you tell us anything about it?
Yeah, I can very much. So I'm just putting the finishing touches to my second book. So the first one written, finished before I had my diagnosis. This second one very much written um, with that new knowledge, with that understanding, and taking a sort of similar but slightly different approach. So in the second book, which is has a title, but that may well change in the process between now and getting it published. I'm looking at three generations of the same family, and they're all affected by autism in different ways. So some of them are autistic and are aware of it. Many of the characters aren't. So it's thinking about sort of plotting the changes of the family, their challenges around being um, about representation, about having a voice, both sort of literal and metaphorical, um, getting help and support and the difficulties of that. But it's also set against the well, near where I live, there's amazing forest which was planted between the two world wars. So this what feels like a permanent part of nature is all of like 100 years old or so. And it was something I was really interested in that the timeline of the forest is the same as the family, but also connecting how autistic people can find solace in nature, which I definitely do, and sort of a freedom and escape there. So yeah, I think it's bigger, it's more ambitious than the first one, and it's been great to actually, it's getting diagnosed and then reassessing yourself is a very difficult thing. And I think I've probably used the writing a lot to look at my experience, but also I was really keen. I didn't want to write a book just from one person's perspective. And I think that's the thing about trying to use literature to represent autism, is I wanted to connect to something of, obviously you can't do all of it, but something of the diversity of autistic experience because it's so vast. And that's where having different characters, different experiences, and them living at different time periods when, um, you know, society knew more and knew less, really kind of came into play.
That sounds so interesting. I'm so excited to read that. It's interesting
Right?
you say that you feel sort of connected to nature and you feel quite calm in nature. 'Cause I've always found that I'm at my calmest, best self when I'm on the Isle of Lewis. That's where my family's sort of from.
Mm,
So I love going there. I just feel like time sort of slows down. My thoughts sort of
yeah.
slow down. It's really, really nice.
Yeah,
Um,
and it's an
yeah.
interesting thing, and I've written about this. Not in fiction. I did a piece for Runner's World magazine titled "Autism Acceptance Week" earlier this year. That was looking at autistic runners and their experience in nature, and it's something I find interesting. That I mean, it could almost it could almost feel like a contradiction that I struggle in. Uh, with some sensory situations, with noise, with light, and all the rest of it, and with unpredictability. But actually, in a natural environment, which can be very noisy, can be bright, can be unpredictable in a sense. It's just, for me at least, it's just escape. It
Mhm.
just it calms me in a way that little else does actually. So
Yeah.
it's quite wonderful.
Yeah, I would say I'm very similar with that. So when you were writing Frey, you said you weren't diagnosed yet. Um, when I wrote my first novel, I wasn't diagnosed either. But then after discovering that I was autistic, if I read back on my book, I can see, oh, a couple of those characters are autistic as well, because obviously writers, we put ourselves into our work. And I found that they had sort of traits similar to myself that I didn't know were autism traits until I read back. I was wondering, when you look back at your previous writing, do you ever think that any of your characters may have also been autistic?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I think I probably had a very
Mhm,
similar experience. So I think, in Frey, the narrator, they're not me, and their situation isn't mine. But I was definitely using it as a way of processing things that I've dealt with, that I've kind of experienced, and I think through that there are moments where sort of setting up the character into, or where they struggle, or there's a lot of they're it's all set in the Highlands, but there's times when they're thinking back to life in the city or life at university and things that they found difficult. And I now understand that those situations, which are kind of slightly mangled versions of things I went through, or imaginations are based on something that I might have experienced, I found those situations difficult because of my needs and my sort of difference to the neurotypical population. So yeah, probably the narrator is autistic.
mhm,
I mean, I think it's interesting as well that the way there's a lot about the book where I'm wanting to write it in a way that people can understand it differently. So there's a lot in that's quite open, and people, I've had people, and this is great, come to me and tell me that um, the meaning of the book is many different things, or even what happens. People have very different interpretations
mhm,
of what actually happens in it, which I really love. So I think I would always be open to people. It's not for me to dictate and say, because it's not described in the book. So I would never say that they were definitely that. But I think my
mhm.
reading of it would be they're very close to me. So probably they are.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Um, it's just so interesting how we put so much of ourselves into our characters, and then even things we don't know about ourselves, we can look back and see
Yeah,
in the books. It's really,
it
I found
is,
it
and
quite surprising
it,
when I
it
was
is
reading mine.
surprising. And I think there's something I really love about writing, that you might sit down. I mean, I don't quite do this, but you could try to sit down, and some people do, with a very clear sense of, here are the characters, here's exactly what they're going to do, in what order, and here's how the thing will end. Um, I don't approach it that way. Some people do. That's great. What I really like is how, when you're writing something, you can be surprised. You'd be like, oh, right, they've done what? Like, okay, the character's doing something, and it's ridiculous because you don't want to say they're doing something I didn't expect or whatever, because obviously you're the one actually writing it.
Mhm,
But you do have those moments of like, oh, okay, they're going to go in a totally different direction now to what I thought, because of I don't know, because a new idea comes to you in the moment, or just because sometimes the rhythm and the writing is pulling you in a certain direction. But I've had, lovely. There's not give it away and say what it is, but there's a surprise or a twist, or there's a something that happens later in the book, and I didn't plan it until I wrote down, and then they saw this thing. I was like, oh, did they? Right,
oh, wow.
fine. No idea I was going to do that. That's quite
Yeah.
good. Maybe we'll go somewhere with it. So yeah, I love that. I also love the idea, and I'm going to forget who said it. I think probably different people have said different versions of this. I'm sure possibly it might have been Don DeLillo, the American writer. I think he might have said a version of this, where the idea that you don't know what you think about something until you try and write it down, because
Mhm,
the discipline of actually trying to force yourself to put it on a page, it's like, do I really think that? It's like, can I actually? So it's that thing of working through an idea or an argument or a position, and I think there's writing is processing all the time, and that's great.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, so obviously you lived 40 years without having a diagnosis. Did you mask throughout those 40 years? Did you find yourself having to hide your true self with people? Um, Obviously, a very common experience for autistic people. And have you found it challenging to unmask since you discovered that you were autistic?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, as you say, I agree entirely. I think it is something that's very common. I think it's probably one of the things as well that I am understanding more. I mean, as we talked about before, it's just been a few years since being diagnosed. I think, the idea of masking is really interesting. I mean, it's very, um, I think it's troubling as well as an idea, that sense of
Mhm,
pretending. And I think certainly quite soon after getting diagnosed, my experience, and again, I think from conversations with other people, I think it's very common. If you are fortunate enough to get an NHS diagnosis, or even if you pay, but certainly with the NHS thing, because things are so stretched, is very much you might go through the process, but that sense of, you know, here, yep, you're autistic. Here's a leaflet. Goodbye,
yeah.
and it ends. And often, an out of date leaflet. The one I think I was given had, you know, website addresses for help services that weren't live anymore and things. So it was quite. That's a really scary kind of cliff edge moment.
Yeah.
And I think I went through a lot of looking back, reassessing, trying to understand. Okay, so what did I do wrong in that? Or not wrong? Sorry, that's the very much not the way to describe it. Why did I react in that situation? And
Mhm.
kind of bring a new understanding and a new kind of compassion to something that I found very difficult. Um, and I think for me, I guess where the masking comes in is um, it's two things. One is about pretending coping and mirroring. I suppose it's trying to, like, I feel painful and uncomfortable in the social situation. I don't understand the rules. I mean, turns out generally there are none, but I don't understand how people are having conversations. I don't understand how people find this easy or enjoyable.
Mhm.
How do I get by in that? So you're pretending you're seeing other people behave and you sort of copy that. I think the second point though is, and this is the bit post diagnosis that's frightening, is the idea of sort of lifting the mask, of stopping pretending. Is it's scary of, okay, well, what's left if I'm not doing that anymore? So how
Yeah.
what is my authentic self? How do you do that? And I think where I've got better at that is sort of getting a sense of being more comfortable with taking that constraint off of behaving like other people. And you come
Mhm.
over time to a closer to an acceptance of difference. And it's not a failure to not be like other people, to not like the same situations as 99% of people, or whatever it might be. So I think it's something I did without knowing I was doing it. It brought a lot of difficulty to me, and I'm still kind of working through, but yeah, but I'm moving on from. But as I say, it's the idea of taking off the mask is scary. It's really frightening.
Yeah. I think one of the hardest things for me that I'm still, I mean, obviously me and you we've been diagnosed relatively recently. And I think figuring out who's authentic us and who is like coming
Yeah.
from being masking is really difficult. It's really difficult to work that out. Even with writing, it's like I grew up trying to prove myself because like my peers wouldn't accept me very much. So I'd be like, okay, well, if I just become successful, they'll have to accept me. And so
Mm,
it's like I've got so much drive in me and passion um, to do something really amazing, like publish books and do all this. But then it's like, where's that stemming from? Is it stemming from a bad place where I'm trying to prove myself, or is it actually
Mm,
something that's authentic to myself? So it's just
yeah.
really a challenge figuring out where that sort of thing stems from and who we authentically are.
Yeah, no, and that's really interesting, and thank you for sharing that. I think yeah, share that view, share that probably that
Mm,
experience. I think there's a couple of thoughts there. I think one is for me at least, speaking to your experience, but for me at least, there's a sense of who you're doing it for.
mhm,
So I think one of the reasons why why I so you know think about being at university, think about it being in my early 20s. Lots of people around me, wanting to write, doing writing, whatever it is. I think I was always very uncomfortable with that because there can be that feeling of, I mean, people posture and there's ego and all the rest of it, and any art or literature kind of area can feel pretentious. It can feel elitist in times. And I think I struggled a lot with the sense that people were writing or frankly talking about writing for the reaction.
mhm,
Um, and I was uncomfortable with that. So I didn't, people didn't know what I was doing, or I would hide it, or I would do it myself. But I think I was definitely stuck for a long time in the motivation for doing it was external.
mhm,
So though I might not have been telling people about it, I was probably thinking of, as you say, the proving a point, the wanting to get to a position of achieving something. I think the bit for me that unlocked, and this is, people don't need this, but for me, this was important, um, was giving up on that, actually,
mhm,
entirely giving up on the sense, and for the writing, on it being for anybody else. I mean, it was, when I started writing for and I had that experience up in Glencoe, it was very much right, okay, I'm going to write something to finish a book for the challenge of doing it. Back then, I really very explicitly had a sense of I won't show this to anyone. I won't publish it. No one will ever see this ever.
mhm,
Full stop. Um, and I think I needed that to in the writing to stop pretending to be other people. We talk about masking. Um, trying to without realizing you're doing it, trying to pretend to be neurotypical or to present characters or story in a way that is what you think people talk like or should talk like or how people should interact um, is exhausting, but also for me probably led to bad writing. I
mhm,
wasn't being authentic because I wasn't drawing on my own experience. I was trying to mimic something that I didn't understand. So I think I found a freedom in that letting go, and it was only years later when I finished it, it was like, okay, actually, maybe there's a value to other people reading this. Maybe they will connect to this, and actually, they can take something from it. Um, but yeah, I really get what you're saying there very much.
yeah. I think my experience is quite similar, because I didn't tell anyone either. I think it's more something at the back of your head that's like a safety net sort of thing, like, I might not be accepted now, but if I'm successful in the future, then they'll have no choice, they'll have to sort
Yeah,
of like me and accept me,
yeah,
um, and so I think it is that, but it's not so much about telling everyone and trying to show off, it's more about feeling like you'll prove to them someday that
yeah,
you're worth sort of spending time with. But
yeah.
yeah,
No,
it's really interesting. But I'm
I
getting
get,
out of that now and writing for myself,
which
similar
is
to you.
great, which I'm really pleased to hear, and I think that's probably
Mhm,
something I would say um, to anybody who struggles with their writing or wants to get into it. And it's a hard thing to do, but finding that internal motivation that is entirely yours, and why you want to tell that story, I think it's really critical. And it might be about having an impact on somebody else, or doing good in the world, or
mhm,
explaining something, raising awareness, improving acceptance, autism, of anything else. But I suppose success and the value of the effort and the extreme effort it can take to write a book over years, not being tied to other people saying it's good, it's bad, great, well done. You can't rely on that, otherwise you'll never get anywhere.
Absolutely, yeah. I might skip ahead a few questions just so that we can stay on this sort of point because with writing, for me, it's as you said earlier, it is about processing. I feel like my head's never clearer than when I'm writing and actually unjumbling up my thoughts and getting them down on paper and figuring everything out. And so there's a study that found that autistic people's brains are on average 42% more active when at rest than neurotypical people. And as I say, writing is a huge tool for this for me because it helps me to process all that information, slows down my thoughts. And I was just wondering whether writing helps you to feel less overwhelmed as well.
Yeah, it does. I mean, I share that entirely.
Mhm,
And I think it's, come back to a point from earlier. I think for me, it's in combination with other things. So if, if I'm writing regularly and if I'm running regularly, the two kind of reinforce each other. The two sort of make each other possible, but they regulate me.
mhm,
And I, well, that's one of the things I'm probably getting, even quite recently, getting a much better understanding of, is that kind of getting your baseline level of anxiety down or under some relative level of control by doing even small things every day, most days, it has such an important, for me, and I'm sure for many others, has such an important effect in not having as much spiky reaction to
mhm.
situations that are difficult and all the rest of it. And writing, the process of it, the rhythm, the escape, the focus, hyper focus is it can be
Mhm.
really healthy there. But as well as that, it lets you directly deal with things and deal with difficult things. There's probably stuff that, oh, there definitely is difficult things that I've worked through in writing that, um, will never, no one will ever read, and that's kind of
Mhm.
not the point of it. The point was the exercise of putting it down on paper and working through it, and that's great. And I don't know anything else probably that has that mixture of rhythm, focus, and escape, but also the creative ability to
Mhm.
unpick a problem, or even just to take you off to something completely different,
Yeah,
and then that can be its own relief as well.
absolutely. Um, so for a lot of people who grow up undiagnosed, books and stories can be a really great escape. If you can't connect to the people around you, you can connect to people in books, and that can be really nice for undiagnosed autistic people. So I was wondering, when you were younger, did you find yourself escaping into stories, and is that sort of something that inspired you to write in the future?
Yeah, it did. And I think it was particularly, for me, it was always escaping to writing them. Obviously I love, I've always loved reading stories and always had a total fascination with it. And you need that, you need a lot of reading, to inform writing. We were at a thing at the Edinburgh Book Festival just recently, and Elle McNichol, the wonderful autistic author, she was talking about reading as being breathing in and writing as being breathing out, which I've never heard before. Which I thought was like, okay,
Yeah.
yeah, that's actually everything she writes perfect. Um, but I think there's a freedom in creating and of feeling unbound. So where being younger and feeling that school or the social expectations of just a neurotypical world, are about confusion, about constraint, about not fitting in, about self doubt, about all the difficulty, the self recrimination, everything that comes from that, total lack of control.
Mhm.
For me, writing's the exact opposite. There's it's the it's the freedom that comes from creating things. And I, when I was younger, that was, from, I don't know, definitely before teens, 8, 9, 10. That's always been onwards. It's always been a big, big thing for me. I think the one other thing I want to say on that is that, over the years, I, I've had an on and off relationship with fiction in particular, and I think I see that. So I would, there'd be times when I just wouldn't read fiction at all,
Mhm.
and I think what the root of that was, I was so impatient for my own writing to get to the point where it was as good. It's ridiculous. You're reading like world famous authors, and you're expecting you're going to sit down with a pen and a piece of paper and be as good in a day, a week, a month, whatever. Um, but I think I I never understood how long it would take to get to a point where you could, I mean, not be as good as other people. It's not about that, but be able to clearly articulate what you want to. Um, so I see now that that process, that apprenticeship, that time it takes, is incredibly valuable. I
Mhm.
really wish I'd known that then, because it's easy to get disheartened and to step away. And I guess then to lose the value and what that's doing for you, in that regular practice and that regular routine.
Mhm. Absolutely. If you could go back in time and give your younger self some advice, what would it be?
It might be that. Um, but I was thinking about this a lot. I think it's really, we talked about, being diagnosed later and sort of reassessing.
Mhm.
Um, I think being kind is probably pretty critical to all of it, because I didn't understand the way my brain functioned, and I was very cruel to myself as a result. I
Mm.
thought that was broken. I thought it was my fault. Um, and I think that can very easily lead to very, very negative thinking, to, really spiraling thought patterns that you get very, as autistic people, we can get very good at practicing things and becoming, very obsessed with things, or really, like, caught on a thought and you just can't let it go.
Yeah.
So I think understanding the importance of being kind when you don't understand something, um, and that, how the world makes you feel, it's not who you are. Your brain, and actually, it's a very basic thing. Not everyone's brain is the same. I suppose that's probably the one thing that I wish beyond anything I understood then. Um, because it's a really crucial idea that if you think everyone thinks the same way, then if you don't, or you can't cope in a situation, then it's very easy, very quick to come to the conclusion that that's your fault.
Yeah. I think that's one of the most difficult things with being undiagnosed because you know you're different, but then you don't have anything to attribute that to other than yourself and your actions. So you'll blame yourself and you'll try and change yourself. And I think that's just really hard for people to grow up doing, not understanding why they can't connect and thinking it must be a problem within them. So, yeah, I absolutely understand what you're saying. And I think it'd be difficult to be kind to yourself when you don't know what's going on. But um, I get that it's something why you'd want to tell your younger self. Next question. Can you tell us a bit about your journey with running and how, if at all, it links to your writing?
Yeah, and I guess we touched on this a little bit. I mean, it's, running and writing, I suppose, have probably been in my life about the same amount of time, but probably writing a little bit more. Running was something I started 10, 11, 12. Um, and fell into really quickly and just loved the freedom of it, the escape, the challenge. I think there's something, for those who are physically capable of it, the challenge of the movement and but of how effort is rewarded and how patient effort. We talked a bit before about how you can manage your baseline of anxiety or mental health. Um, there's something about so incredibly rewarding about if you practice any sort of physical activity a couple of times a week or more, that over weeks, months, years, it slowly builds and builds and builds. And that's a great I don't know, it's a great lesson in patient application of effort, how
Mhm.
that can pay off. But it just made me feel better. Um, and as a result, I think I write a lot about running. There's a lot in Frey about it. Um, I'm really interested in, writing's all about creativity, but for me, I kind of I see running has been quite comparable. That, and I touch on this in the book, that when you go out for a run, the person that comes back at the end of the run isn't the same. You are generally, you're tired and all the rest of it, but
Mhm.
generally calmer, happier, generally a slightly more less tense, relaxed view of the world and problems. Um, and I like the idea of running as being like a creative, almost a rebellious act that you aren't you're not accepting the world as it is, or you're not accepting a particular situation. That if you go off and go out in the world, then actually, yeah, you can become different. That's the wrong word, but you can build something.
Yeah,
And I love that about it.
that's really interesting. It reminds me of a book I read a few years ago, What I Talk About When I Talk About Running by Haruki Murakami. That sort of he finds that running fuels his writing and vice versa. He's a very avid runner and of course, an incredible writer. So I was wondering if you've read that as well.
Yeah,
Yeah.
repeatedly. I love it. And I think that, lots of runners do really love it, and I think anybody I know who's interested in running and writing, it's a big thing for them.
Mhm.
It's a really interesting book because it's very calm, it's very quiet in a way. Like, it's not nonfiction; it's describing his own journey, and ostensibly not very much happens. But the grace with which he describes something so physical and actually quite difficult to write about is fascinating. And
Yeah.
one of the other bits that I've really taken from it, and come back to that idea of slowly building something out of repeating small amounts of effort over time. Um, he's got a line somewhere in the book about, for him as a novelist, as a inspiring, brilliantly successful, incredible novelist.
Mhm.
But as somebody who sits down to write books that are hundreds of pages long, seeing running not as just like I've done my day's work and it's an escape and stress relief and move on, but actually seeing running as a physical training for the rigor and the effort and like the stamina needed to write a book. I love that because it feels so sort of possibly back to front or counterintuitive, but
Yeah.
there's a recognition there that the two are similar in that they
Mhm.
require massive amounts of patience, but that actually, writing, particularly over a course of years, is exhausting. And the stress and the drain and the anxiety that can come from like trying to really bear yourself on a page or create something. Um, I think they're wonderful observations. So no, I really, really adore that book.
Me too. Um, could you tell us about some of the main challenges you've experienced in your day-to-day life due to being autistic?
Yeah, and again, I think we've sort of touched on this a little bit,
Mhm.
and I understand these much better now, and I think I'm probably, getting to a point where can manage them a bit more and seeing how that has positive, ripples, how that kind of builds. Um, Sensory difficulties is a big one for me. I mean, I see that now that, I mean, thank goodness for online shopping and all the rest of it and being able to avoid
Yeah.
supermarkets mostly. Um, but, light and noise are definitely things that are challenging for me. Lack of structure, anything that's unpredictable, I kind of don't know, is planned out and changes.
Mm.
And then socializing. Um, and again, that's also structure and predictability. Um, so, the idea of meeting people to go for a drink at a vaguely specified time in a place that's bright lights, noisy, can't hear people, it's you very quickly come to a really nightmarish situation for
Yeah.
me. But I think the one of the things I guess that I've been understanding more about recently is, across those different challenges is, and many people will get this and sure have their own experience of this, um, is about how connected they all are. So actually, if anything across those sort of three areas throws me off, then the sort of the dysregulation that follows and how that makes all of the others just so much harder to deal with. I think it's
Mhm.
taken me quite a long time to get my head around that. And then, as a result of which, I think I am slowly getting better at asking for accommodations, about feeling more comfortable, or just saying no to things. And I think that's probably been the most freeing thing for me of being able to get a diagnosis is in a work situation or whatever situation, just saying, I'm not can't come to the after work drinks thing.
Yeah.
It's just not going to work for me. Have a great
Mhm.
time, you know. Or even very small things like, you know, glare of light is something I find really difficult. So,
Mm.
artificial lights and or sunshine coming through a window at a certain time of day or whatever it might be. And tiny things like just going, being the first, if I have to be in an in-person meeting, being the first person into a room and just working out, right, okay, which is the seat which is going to throw me off the
Yeah.
least. Or if something kicks off, being able just saying to people, um, I'm really sorry, but can we swap? Do you mind? Because I
Mhm.
know that that little thing, or to them, which they possibly won't even notice, there might be a sound or a visual thing, whatever it might be, over the course of the hour that we might be sitting in the room, um, is just like a drill in my brain. And by the end of it, I'm just going to be useless. I'm just not going to be able to do anything at all.
Mhm.
Um, so, yeah, it's interesting to understand these things. And so the interconnectedness, that's something I really think a lot about at the minute.
Yeah. Um, Absolutely. There are, of course, a lot of challenges with being autistic, but it can also help us in some areas. So for me, with my writing, it helps me with spotting mistakes. I feel like I'm quite good at analyzing a text and finding little mistakes. Do you find that being autistic helps you in any area of your writing?
I think it's very similar. And before I got into the writing, my work's always been in journalism first, and then kind of different areas of communications for different organizations. And mistakes didn't go past me at all. I mean, it's I think different jobs have definitely had the reputation for being the person that you go to if you really want to check the thing is completely fine. Um, and because I mean, it's partly it's about pattern recognition and being very sharp to, like, you instantly something just screams at you on a page. So that detail side of things helps. But the focus, hyper focus, I think, when you're in a good place and the flow is working and you can really absorb yourself in something, I think that can be great for writing. The slight caveat to that, though, is that can go too far because you can get too focused on the writing and then you burn yourself up entirely, or you don't stop and drink and eat and all those things that are slightly important. Um, but there are benefits, absolutely.
Mhm. Yeah, the hyper focus, like when I'm writing, can be absolutely incredible. It's the best feeling, just to completely be in that flow state. But then also, it's not like every time you go and write, you're hyper focused. Sometimes it's
Uh,
really, really hard to just get words on the page. Sometimes you're just
yeah,
not in that state.
yeah, totally. And running's the same. You get
Mhm.
that, and again, you don't get it every time, but any sense of that flow and that freedom when you're running or you're writing or whatever, that is a very, very special thing.
Yeah. Next question is quite a big one. What does being autistic mean to you?
Yeah, God, it is a big one, isn't it? And
Yeah.
it kind of connects back to that thing we talk about the advice to yourself when you were younger. Um, I think I certainly I understand it as it's about at a very basic level, it's about being different and not being broken. And that's the main transition in the way that I understand myself, and that's been probably the most valuable thing. Um, but I think there's also something about, I think, and others might disagree with that, or neurotypical others may disagree with this,
Mhm,
but I do think there's something about seeing the world as it is. I don't, and telling things as they are. There's something about the though it can be overwhelming. I think there's an honesty, in a sense, to autistic experience and in a way that we get straight to the point. Many of us, the way we would, understand things, the way we require clarity, actually,
mhm,
that I think is brilliantly valuable, and I think is about, well, I suppose it's seeing the world as it is, but maybe it's also seeing the world as it should be, and that
mhm.
things would maybe be a bit clearer, a bit better if everybody was straight to the point and we didn't have all the obfuscation and all the bits around the edges.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's, honesty as well. Like,
Yeah,
a joke around my friends and family is that Heather can't lie. Heather just
yeah,
can't
yeah,
lie. You will be able to detect it right away if I try and tell you a lie or try and hide something from you, you'll just be able to see it in my face.
yeah. And I
But I
think
think it's a
that's
good
it.
thing.
It is a really good thing, and I think it's that level of integrity is is a brilliant thing. God, the world needs that more than ever.
Yeah.
But yeah, honesty is seeing the world truthfully and not being able to say otherwise. And I think that's a
Mm,
great, great, great thing.
absolutely. Um, what are your favorite books of all time? Difficult
Well, you
question
go from
again.
big question to big question. The very, very favourite is Beloved by Toni Morrison. So it's a book I read in my early mid 20s, first time, and I've reread it, you know, every couple of years since then. Get different things out of it every time. I mean, she was incredible story, about the legacy of slavery and racism and about violence, prejudice, and love, and just everything about it is just so incredibly put together. But there's something very, I mean, I would think close to impossible to do to write so beautifully about things that are so awful. So
Mm,
actually to have control over language to the point that you can um, write with such grace about extreme and horrific human suffering is unreal, unbelievable, and it's just everything about it is just totally perfect. Um, Talked a bit about Murakami, so his
mhm,
fiction's amazing as well. And there's two other books that that I kind of always mention when I'm asked something like this. One is a book called Lanny by Max Porter, and another book called Lincoln and the Bardo by American writer called George Saunders. And both were really important to me when I was writing Frey, because they're very much in control of their own voice. They're very distinctive, different, kind of edgy books, and both really pushed me on to um, finding my own way of writing something and not to stop trying to pretend to write like other people.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I've not read any of those books, but I'll put them on my list. Absolutely. Um, could you recommend some books that are written by autistic people or that portray autistic characters?
Yeah, so and there definitely needs to be more. We'll say that, and
Hmm.
well, I'm writing one, so I've every intention of writing many more after that.
Yeah.
One I read relatively recently, that was book nominated last year. So All the Little Bird Hearts by Victoria Lloyd Barlow, who's autistic. I thought was a really good, genuine drawing of autistic experience. I got a lot out
Hmm.
of that. Was very interested, and this is a very well-known book, but The Reason I Jump, that sort of looks at non-speaking autistic perspectives. I found that really valuable, and the film that this sort of kind of the creative spin-off of the film that made from that's really interesting as well.
Hmm.
Um, but the other one, which I just think is, I mean, is recognized as this, but is groundbreaking, is totally brilliant, is Kind of Spark, the Al McNichol book.
Yeah.
And, and the TV series that's followed as well. I just think everything I mean, what I would give to have read, she
I know.
probably
Me
wasn't
too.
alive when I was 10, but what I would have given to have read that, and that it's really available then, is, I mean, the value of it is immense. Um, and I just cried my heart out reading it, because for young people today to have that, to see themselves in that way, um, it's priceless. It's amazing.
Yeah. Have you read the book that came out this year about Addie's sister, Kitty?
Yes, which is
Yeah,
yeah,
me
is
too.
also fantastic.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's really good, and again, that she's drawing different autistic experiences, across within the two sisters. That they have similarities, but they have their own experience, their own ways of sort of seeing and interacting
Mhm.
with the world, and how she deals with social expectation and bullying and cruelty and adults misunderstanding children. Yeah, it's really, really phenomenal.
Mhm. Absolutely, I love those books as well, and the TV show. Um, you've described experiencing autistic burnout in the past. Would you mind telling us a bit about what autistic burnout is like and any lessons you've learned about preventing it from happening? I feel like not a lot of people understand what autistic burnout is and how it
Mm,
differs from regular burnout.
sure, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'm very happy to talk about it. It's a kind of difficult thing to talk about. It's a really, really horrific experience. And I was kind of
Yeah.
looking just before we got on this at the National Autistic Society. That there's a description around talking about it as being like a prolonged 3-month plus period of time where, where you can't function basically. But I think the thing I want to touch on is, it's a horrendous, horrific experience, and we'll talk a little bit about what it feels like. But it's doubly so when you don't understand what's happening. You don't know what
Mhm.
it is, and I've had, as many autistic people had, multiple um, periods of very bad burnout where you can't do anything at all. You're completely unable to work and to function and to do anything. I mean, for me, it something that build up. So it's about anxiety building up. It's about losing control. But I think what's most frightening about it is that sense of that feeling of total exhaustion, total overwhelm, um, and just not being able to function, to think.
Mhm.
I had a period a couple of years ago where I couldn't work. It was really, really difficult. And I mean, I couldn't do anything. I was
Yeah.
really destroyed by what had been probably, it was around COVID time when, I think like a lot of autistic people, the world opening up again and being very uncertain, coming out of lockdowns. Lockdowns were difficult, but there was a clarity and a certainty to you stay in your house. Here are the rules. Um, Coming out of that and re-emerging into society and life becoming much more overwhelming again was just too much for me. And there was a process of a couple of months that really built up to a real prolonged shutdown. And I mean, the word I suppose describes it well, of burnout. That you feel burnt, you feel there's nothing
Mm.
left. Um, but about learning from it, um, I think one of the important things for me has been understanding how anxiety builds over time, and actually, not to grit your teeth, not to push through something because it's not like you're gonna achieve the work thing, the personal thing. You're going to deal with whatever the situation is, and the anxiety will suddenly go away. You
Yeah.
might achieve whatever it is, but you've now got a massively elevated level of anxiety, or the way of looking at it, a massively depleted ability to cope with anything else going wrong.
Mm.
Um, so I think, come back to the earlier point, what I've learned, kindness, we talk about that in every sense you could understand it, consistency. So actually me making lots of tiny changes in a day or a week, being regular with my running, being regular with my writing, small things like, talks about avoiding the social thing at work, or just saying I won't do a certain type of event ever, full stop,
Mhm.
unless like it's a wedding and you absolutely have to, or something. Even then, maybe just a bit. um, but removing lots of tiny stresses actually keeps what might be a bumpy baseline of anxiety relatively stable,
Mhm.
to avoid it building, because when it builds, it can get out of control really quickly. And I
Yeah.
think that's probably the main thing I'm trying to understand, is that the small changes done regularly are really what keep me together.
Next question is, what are your goals for the future?
Yeah, and I mean, I think as a like diagnosed autistic person, I mean, keeping on going with understanding myself, accepting myself, I think that's really important. And with the writing, I, having written a book when I wasn't diagnosed, and now finishing one when I am, I just want to keep using writing that connects to neurodivergent and neurotypical people about
Mhm.
autism and what it is. I mean, I think whether that's fiction, non-fiction, that I'm slightly undecided on. It possibly it's both, but I think that's a thing to commit to aim for.
Absolutely. Um, what's something that people would be surprised to know about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think, not having watched me talk about it for an hour, but for many people, even people I meet now, I think that I am autistic is a surprise, and I
Yeah.
think it was a surprise to me. I suppose is the other way of looking at it, and I think there's something really important about that, of how, as a somebody who can communicate verbally, almost all the time, unless things are really difficult, and who has generally, holds a job, who, it's a horrible phrase, but looks normal. People
Mm.
don't see the things that we hide, and I think there's something there about, you know, um, other, personally, I sort of take almost a slight sense of responsibility of it's important that I talk about where I am and my own distinctive experience, which is mine and nobody else's, to just help people understand. I don't know, be a bit more not jumping to a quick conclusion that just because
Mm,
I'm in a job and can be coherent most of the time,
yeah.
that there's not other things going on. And I'm really interested in the idea that, and that this is a troubling thing that we many people hold down jobs and social commitments and all the rest of it and mask, and then they come home, they collapse, and
Mhm,
they're just broken and they're exhausted and they're wrecked. And I think there's something there about what we hide, and yeah, that's interesting. So
mm. Yeah, I think it's taught me just to be kind to everyone because you never know what's going on.
yeah,
They could be acting, you know, in a way, presenting very typically in a situation, and then they could go home and they could be dealing with,
yeah,
burnout from that, or they could be having meltdowns from having a difficult day. You
hundred
just
percent,
never know. So it's just important to always be kind to everyone,
yeah,
wherever possible. So, final question: what is your favorite thing about yourself?
yeah. You talk about difficult questions. When you
Yeah.
sent this one through and thinking about it, I mean, I think I talked a bit, talked before about what what being autistic means. I think my favorite thing about myself, and this links very much to that, is just the degree to which I care about things. So, and some things I'm obviously like everybody I'm disinterested in, but if there's something I'm interested in and I'm bothered about, then I think it's a great strength for any of us to like really, really meaningfully care. And that can be about people, that can be about working hard to achieve things that matter to you or to others and about making a difference. But I think there's just something very fundamental about being bothered, about being
Mhm.
turning up. And yeah, I think I do like that. I think my willingness to do things that help other people is something I like. Yeah,
Mm.
I'm comfortable with that.
That's really nice, to hear. But that's our time up for today. It was so great to talk to you, Chris. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you very much.